Hello, I'm Peter Houston, Archivist and Special Collections Librarian, and this is a brief video introduction to our 17th century English holdings at the Mount Royal University Archives and Special Collections. So we have a number of works, not a huge number of works, but maybe about a dozen books and pamphlets that were produced in England in the 17th century. And they're really interesting as primary sources from which to kind of learn about the crises and conflicts of that very tumultuous century. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of some of the highlights. Here is a pamphlet from the English Civil War. So we have a number, we have six pamphlets in total from the English Civil Wars. And this is very typical. These things were produced in quickly, cheaply, and in great numbers by both sides, by both parliamentarians and royalists, and were really used as propaganda to kind of celebrate their victories, denigrate their enemies, and kind of get their message out there in order to kind of persuade people as to the justness of their cause. This one is a parliamentarian publication. So this is published in London in 1642, in the summer of 1642. It basically explains a recent resolution passed by Parliament to condemn and fine those members of Parliament from the House of Commons and the House of Lords that left the city of London to go join King Charles I up in York. At this time, the king had actually fled from London. He had been having a long-running dispute with Parliament, and in January of 1642, he fled to the north, where he began trying to kind of raise support for his cause, trying to raise soldiers and arms and money in order to kind of face down Parliament in what was to become the First English Civil War. So here is kind of Parliament's response. This is very typical of the pamphlets of the period. It's quite a small little thing, maybe the size of a small paperback, just about 8 pages long on fairly kind of flimsy paper, not illustrated except for these sort of simple woodcuts. Occasionally they would illustrate them with kind of cartoonish looking woodcuts in the style of almost like a political cartoon, but the examples that we have unfortunately don't have those. But yeah, this just shows you the types of pamphlets that were being produced in great numbers in these sort of pamphlet wars during the English Civil War. And there was a real explosion in sort of printed works in that period. In 1641, Parliament, as part of its sort of dispute with the king, had dissolved the Court of the Star Chamber and the Court of the High Commission, some of these important sort of royal and ecclesiastical courts that had basically governed the system of print censorship in England, which had been pretty strict up to that point. But with the dissolution of those courts, the system of censorship was basically dissolved, and there was just a resulting kind of explosion in pamphlets like this that were produced, both relating to the war and kind of political issues, but also related to kind of religious controversies as well. One thing I want to kind of mention too was the reach of these things. So pamphlets like this were produced in small numbers, often numbering in the hundreds of issues. So not huge print runs, but they reached a much wider audience. For one thing, because they were passed around, so you could buy these for relatively cheap on the street in London or the other sort of big cities of England. And then once read, you could easily pass them on to someone else. And so they would kind of go hand to hand, often to people that actually read them out loud. The majority of the population, English population, was still illiterate. So this would help kind of, broadcast the message contained in these pamphlets further still by kind of spreading it. I want to show you another example of an English Civil War pamphlet, or kind of actually published just before the war broke out. This is a Royalist pamphlet, also published that same summer, 1642. But this, whereas the other one was from the parliamentarian perspective, this one is very much from a Royalist viewpoint. So it contains three kind of documents. The first, a petition by the, as you can see here, the gentry, ministers, and freeholders of the county of Flint. This is Flintshire, the county of Flintshire in northern Wales, basically pledging their sort of allegiance and support to the king, who at this point was still in York. Again, still trying to kind of raise arms and money for the conflict that was just about to break out. It also contains the king's response, where he thanks them for his support and pledges to sort of protect them and uphold the laws of the land. And then it also contains, you can see the bottom of this long title. They love these long titles in the 17th century. You can see it contains His Majesty's speech to the gentlemen of York on Thursday, the 4th of August, which I think is a interesting text, because he really gets into some of the grievances that he has with Parliament. And he also puts in sort of a plea for people to join him at York and bring money and arms as well. One of the neat things about this is it was published, as you can see, in London. At the bottom it says printed by A. Norton, 1642, on August 12th. It's kind of striking that it was, printed just 8 days after the speech was given by the king on the 4th of August. So it shows you, how quickly by the 17th century, news could travel from York down to London, and also how quickly printers could print off something like this in order to kind of distribute the text of the speech. You can see sort of mass communication kind of coming together here. At this time too, they were starting to publish news books, which were kind of like the predecessor to our modern newspapers. These were pamphlets like this, little 8-page things often, that were published weekly and would sort of inform the public of current events, often from, again, a very partisan viewpoint. So there would be parliamentarian news books and royalist news books. Another interesting thing about this is the name of the printer. So there were, probably most English printers, of course, were located in the city of London. There was printing taking place elsewhere. The King's headquarters at Oxford saw a lot of royalist propaganda printed there, and some of the other major cities as well had printing presses. This one's neat because A. Norton, I looked up, I was just curious who this printer was, and the only A. Norton that I could find operating at this period was one Alice Norton, who was active in London from 1641 to 1642. And so a woman. And this was in sort of there's a proud kind of tradition of women involved in the book arts in the medieval period that continued on into sort of printed texts in the early modern. And the English Civil War was a real opportunity for women to get involved because, for one thing, so many men were off fighting in the English Civil Wars, but also to, there was such, especially with the abolishment of the censorship system, and a real desire for information about what was actually going on in this very messy conflict. There was a real market for pamphlets of all sorts. A lot of women were able to kind of either break into the book trade at this time. So that's kind of a neat example of that. Okay, maybe I'll just end off by saying, so we have another 4 pamphlets that I wasn't able to show today, but some of them are really interesting. One related to the siege of a castle just west of England, Basing House, which is a real interesting read if you're interested in sort of English Civil War military history. Has a real kind of good blow-by-blow account of the siege. Let's move on away from pamphlets and talk a little bit about some of the books that we have from the 17th century. So this is a history of the Parliament of England, as you can see, published in 1647. It was commissioned by Parliament, so they were commissioning a history of Parliament sort of by Parliament. And as you can expect with that, it was a very, it provides, a very interesting kind of partisan account of the conflict that the English Parliament had with the king, and then the subsequent kind of English Civil War. When this was published in 1647, Parliament was victorious. The king had been defeated and captured, but this can be read as really interesting to kind of see. Not only does it provide a lot of detail about sort of the conflict that started this war, but also talks a lot about the war itself, but again from a very, very kind of partisan propaganda kind of viewpoint. So From the other side, you can see we've tried to kind of gather a nice collection that represents both Royalists and Parliamentarians. This is a very much a work of Royalist propaganda. In this tiny little book, it's a very, very small volume, but quite thick, because it contains two books. The first, as you can see here, Reliquiae Sacrae Carolinae, or the works of that great monarch and glorious martyr, King Charles I. The other work is so this one's published in 1650. The other one is called Eikon Basilike, or the Image of the King, published a year previous in 1649. These were both published just after King Charles I was tried and executed for treason in London by the victors of the Civil War, by Parliament. And so in response, the Royalists commissioned this work, or these two works, to be created, which basically kind of mythologize the king, try to sort of recast him not as a defeated and failed monarch, but as a true Christian martyr, a martyr for his faith, and the true king of England. As you can guess, they probably couldn't have published this kind of thing in London, since the parliamentarians were victorious and it was now a republic, the Commonwealth of England. But you can see down at the bottom it says actually published in The Hague, so over in the Netherlands in 1650. So this was a really influential work. A lot of people read this. They were smuggled over into England, and it went through like 36 editions in 1649 alone, which was the year the king was executed. And it really helped support the sort of royalist cause, and to the point where during the Restoration, when Charles I's son, Charles II, was restored to the throne of England, was able to come home from exile and become the English king, the Church of England actually canonized Charles I as an official saint, partly based on the sort of mythology that this book kind of perpetrated. So, I just wanted to give you a quick idea of what some of it contains. Letters that the king sent to the queen during the course of the war. That's what you can see here. So interesting kind of first-hand material, as well as what was purported to be the sort of religious writings of the king as he awaited his trial and execution, though they may have not been written by him. And then it ends with, here we have His Majesty's last speech on the scaffold at his martyrdom on January 30th. Actually, it should be 1649. There they've made a mistake. But interesting to see the speech that he gave just before he was executed. So we have a few other items that are from after the period of the English Civil Wars. Here is a work, a religious work. This is a Puritan religious tract. Predestination, as before privately, so now at last openly defended against post-destination, and so on. The titles go on forever in the 17th century. So this is interesting and really speaks to the great kind of religious conflicts of this period. Here we have a defense of predestination, this Calvinist belief that salvation, heaven cannot be attained by good works, but it is sort of God's decision alone. And there's this idea with predestination that all of humanity is predestined to either go to heaven or hell, and this is preordained. And so nothing that any of us do in this life can have any effect on that decision. It's God's decision. God's grace alone determines sort of whether we achieve salvation or not. This, of course, was a very controversial topic in the religious debates of the period, and was actively suppressed under Charles I. And so that's why the title is Predestination, as before privately, and so now at last openly defended, because previously this sort of work would never have been allowed to have been published. But this was published in 1656, which is after the king was executed in 1649. This is during the Commonwealth of England, the Interregnum, the period between the kings when Oliver Cromwell was Lord Protector of England, and there was sort of a new spirit of religious tolerance in England that allowed works like this, Calvinist works by English Puritans, these sort of more radical Protestants, to be published. This was to come to a close in 1660 when Charles II was restored to the throne, and the Church of England moved quickly to suppress Puritan works like this from being published and distributed. So an interesting sort of item or artifact of that brief period of sort of greater religious toleration. I want to show you one last book. This has nothing to do with toleration. This has to do with the witch trials in England at the time. This book was originally published in 1681. Our edition's a little later, from 1726. But this is a work known as Sadducismus Triumphatus, or A Full and Plain Evidence Concerning Witches and Apparitions. This was written by Joseph Glanville. You can see on the title page here it says Chaplain in Ordinary to King Charles II. It was published just after his death, as I said, in 1681. And basically what it is a full-throated defense of the sort of ongoing prosecution of supposed witches, basically a defense of the witch trials. At this point, the witch trials were sort of coming under increased kind of criticism and skepticism, and so Glanville was kind of reacting to that. In his book, he pulls evidence both from Scripture, from the Bible itself, as well as evidence from sort of contemporary 17th century witch trials in England and abroad, to basically make the case that witches do exist, and therefore they need to be suppressed. They're enemies of God, and all the criticism of them is totally misplaced. So it's a very interesting. It was a very kind of influential work in that period of kind of the witch trials. Here there's this delightful frontispiece. This is showing a scene from the book of Samuel and the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament. Here you can see that this was a piece of, or sort of a scene from Scripture that was often used as evidence, sort of biblical evidence of the existence of witches. Here we have the Hebrew king Saul consults with this figure on the right is the Witch of Endor. It was translated in sort of early modern translations. Who raises for him, he wants information. He's going to be going into battle with the Philistines, and so he wants to consult with, here she's raised the spirit of the prophet Samuel from the dead to consult with him. So again, this sort of episode was often used as sort of biblical evidence for the existence of witches. I was saying he often in this work pulls from kind of more contemporary 17th century evidence as well. So here, this page, this little illustration shows some illustrations of scenes from kind of evidence provided in witch trials. Here we have a demon drummer. There's people consulting with the devil, levitation, all sorts of things that, again, were pulled from evidence that was provided in witch trials during this period. A lot of it, extracted under torture. So a really interesting book if you're kind of looking at that period of the prosecutions for witchcraft. And yeah, just another example of some of the interesting 17th century items that we have in our collection. Ordinarily, you could come in and take a look at any of these in person at the MRU Archives and Special Collections on the 4th floor of the Riddell Library and Learning Center. Of course, we're closed right now during the pandemic, but if you were interested in taking a look at any of these, you can go to our website and get in touch with us. You can even just send an email to archives@mtroyal.ca, and we're happy to digitize sections of these if you want to take a look. So. Some of these also have been digitized by other institutions and are available sort of full text online. But we are hoping once the pandemic's over to open again, and then anyone is welcome to come in and consult these pretty amazing texts, which are incredible sources for the study of the 17th century, particularly the 17th century in England. All right, thanks very much for watching.